Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're looking at the story of David, and this is the 17th installment. This is called Anchors of Faith. Anchors of Faith. So we left last week in the middle of witnessing the consequences of David's sins of adultery and murder. Sins were compounded by David's choice not to reconcile with God right away. We are going to take a closer look at the consequence of the death of his and Bathsheba's illegitimate son shortly. But now we need to finish the consequences that I think fall under God's judgment that out of your household I am going to bring calamity upon you. So, picking up from where we last left off, last time we saw how David's son, Absalom, turned on his father. It wasn't a total surprise since Absalom had been neglected by his father for years. Recall that Absalom's strategy was to win over the people. And we read this in verse 15:6 of 2 Samuel. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So the power struggle was underway. Battles were about to commence. And we ended up with David in serious trouble. He's running in verse 14. Then David said to all of his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." And then look at verse 16, because it's significant what happens next. This information. The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at a place some distance away. Okay. And then as David and his men are out trying to stay alive, a significant thing happens. Something that God had warned David about through the prophet Nathan. And I'm talking about in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, which we read about. This is Nathan speaking for the Lord. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your eyes, your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but he will do this thing in broad day. But I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. So what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 21? Let me set that up. Absalom asked a man named Ahithophel, who was one of David's advisors, and has now switched sides to be on Absalom's side. Absalom asked, "What should we do?" And this is his response in verse 21. Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. This was just as God had foretold. Absalom slept with David's concubines, which would be wives essentially. This would look like evidence that Absalom was now king. Notice where he pitched his tent. On the palace roof is where he pitched it, the very place where David's sin of coveting and adultery occurred. So a big battle was building. I want to jump all the way to chapter 18. David has prepared his armies, and I'll read from chapter 18, verse 6. The army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There the army of Israel was defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. Someone will need to explain to me sometime what that means, that the forest claimed more lives than the sword. Must be pretty treacherous out there in that forest. So David's side wins. Don't miss that David was fighting against the army of Israel. That was his own army, once his army. And then we come to yet another tragedy, a final consequence. The violence within the family, as the Lord told David. Although given explicit orders to spare the life of his son, what happens? Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. When one of the men saw this, he told Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And then in verse 14, Joab took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. So David wants to know what happened to his son. In verse 31, the Cushite arrived and said, My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you. The king asked the Cushite, Is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. I guess it's a clever way of saying Absalom's dead. We then read about David's reaction to this final tragedy. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son. So David is left grieving for the death of a third son. We're talking about consequences. Although grace cancels the debt of sin, it doesn't necessarily cancel the consequences of sin, especially if it is for correction or discipline from God. God's forgiveness is sure, but so is sin's harmful fallout. When temptation comes our way, if we ask ourselves, how many innocent people will suffer as a consequence of my sin? It may be a big help in resisting the temptation. Sin can injure our family, our own reputation, but most importantly, our relationship with God. I can imagine David wished he had thought before he acted. All right, we're going to go back and relook at David's confession and consequences of his sin. As we studied earlier, David had owned up to his sin back in chapter 12 when he said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Simple confession. God in his grace released David from the death penalty the law demanded. What the law said was, in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. As for his other sin, murder, we have Exodus chapter 21. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. And more specifically for this case, if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. But what God said through Nathan, we read in chapter 12, verse 13. The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. So what was the grace God showed David? It was that he wasn't going to die. But there was a consequence. God would take the life of David's illegitimate son. The baby was already born by this time. So David's escaped God's penal judgment, death, and so David stood clean before God. He was forgiven and restored, but he hadn't escaped the discipline. There was so much violence in David's family, death of sons, and that was part of this household calamity consequence. But I'm going to concentrate now on this death of the baby. Would we all agree that there's a difference between punishment and discipline? Punishment and discipline. Would we all agree with this? The death of the baby was designed to show David how serious sin is to the holy God and to protect David from future failure. That would be more on the discipline side. Was the baby's death, therefore, God's discipline rather than punishment? Chrysostom wrote, God imposes a penalty upon us, not to punish us for past sins, but to correct us against future ones. I'm thinking that's what happened here. And I think we can learn something by how David reacted to this discipline. Now, Chuck Swindoll, a person I greatly respect, compares what happened to David as a consequence of his sin to what happens to a boat in a harbor when a storm comes. So his metaphor is a boat in a harbor. What can happen to a boat? One boat, tied loosely to its moorings, snaps its rope and is carried out by the violent currents to crash upon the rocks. Another boat is secured to the dock and firmly anchored. It rides out the storm and is ready to sail again when the storm is over. So continuing with that Chuck's boat metaphor, when Nathan told David the first part of the storm would be his baby's death, David had to decide how to react. He could ride it out, loose from his moorings, with no anchors, and end up broken on the rocks of bitterness, or he could stay tied up and drop anchors. Chuck identifies 4 anchors of faith. As we go through the story, we see that David stayed connected to God, helped by these 4 anchors of faith. So I'm going to have to go through quickly because time is just going quickly here. So let's move to 2 Samuel chapter 12, 15. We'll get a little more detail than we did last time about the situation with the baby. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and went into his house, and spent the nights lying on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. The first anchor of faith I see here is that he prayed. This was a painful time for David, but instead of running from God, David ran to God. He pleaded to God for the life of his son. He spent a lot of time with the Lord, probably searching his soul. As long as there was a chance that God might spare the child, David prayed. Then verse 18, on the 7th day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, we spoke to David, but he would not listen to us. How can we tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his servants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. The second anchor of faith, then, is that he faced the consequences realistically. The baby died. His servants were afraid to tell him, but David's response was surprisingly calm. Instead of blaming himself more, he put himself back together. He went to worship God. The baby was dead, and he couldn't change that, but he could accept what he had received from God's hand. He could humbly bow before God, knowing God was both merciful and just. Continuing on, David then went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His servants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat." His servants were in fact surprised at David's response. David's answer tells us where David secured his hope. It was in God. He said in verse 22, he answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." So this third anchor of faith would be he claimed God's truths. David's response shows that he believed God was in control, both of his destiny and also his son's. His son was gone, but one day he would see him again. He believed in the hope of heaven. They would be reunited. That's how many interpret that. I will go to him. Even in the middle of his suffering, David relied on God's truth. And then what happened with David? The fourth anchor, verse 24. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. The fourth anchor of faith then was he went on. David went on, refusing to give up. After mourning his loss with his wife, David found the strength to live again. It's tempting to focus so much on what we've lost that we forget about what we have. There is some truth to that saying. Bitterness and regret over yesterday's pain can rob us of today's joy. Has that happened to you or someone you know? It's so true. Regardless of whether we encounter God's discipline or just trouble in general, we can think of handling it like David did. I want to put those 4 anchors up and just think about that. Faced with just any kind of trouble, whether it just be life or discipline, the 4 anchors of faith David used was he prayed, he faced the consequences realistically, he claimed God's truths, and he went on, refusing to give up. I'll leave you with those thoughts. So, everyone take care. May the Lord be with you.